Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ian Samreese. I'm a principal based in the Singapore office. I've been doing emerging market consulting for almost 20 years.
My name's Sarovar Agrawal. I'm a principal with the Melbourne office. I've spent almost 15 years now, slightly less than Ian, but about 15 years working in emerging markets. And we looked at the top 60 developed economies in the world and how they're investing across emerging markets. And what's interesting to note is Australia's GDP, they're ranked 12th in the world. And with that, there are smaller economies. If you look at Singapore, right, they're the 36th largest economy in the world. But they're the biggest investor into Indonesia. They're investing $53 billion into Indonesia. There are nations that are very proactively thinking about some of these emerging markets and then going out and making a concerted effort. And then if I contrast the investments that Australian companies and Australian businesses making, there are some good, clear investment countries, but there are others, right, that are fairly negligible. If you look at India, it's $450 million is all that Australia invested in terms of foreign direct investment into the country. So the opportunity is there. So Telenor is this Nordic telecom company. They're the market leader in Norway. And if you look at what they've done, right, their strategy is very, very interesting. They were based in Norway, and if they would not have diversified into Asia and into emerging markets, the revenues actually have declined over the last many years, right? Over the last 11 years, the revenues just in Norway have actually gone down. But their growth has primarily been driven by Asia. That's the one interesting fact about Telenor. The second interesting fact is if you look at the countries they've chosen to be in, again, offers some interesting insight into the thinking, right? They haven't, and again, for good reason, they haven't gone into Indonesia, they haven't gone into China, and the most profitable, interestingly, is Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is 60% EBITDA for them, which you'd sort of wonder how they're able to do it, right? They entered in 1996 when the telecom market didn't even really exist there. And they've been the market leaders ever since, and now they're so dominant. Which other markets offer the next wave of potential? And that's why we came up with some hidden stars, right? There's Cambodia, there's Myanmar, there's Sri Lanka.
But the key point I want to get through across to you is that you need to do some homework, right? You need to actually go and study the markets. You need to understand what people want. Indonesia and the Philippines. And let's talk about what are some of the winning retail concepts. If you're driving in rural Philippines and you see a wooden shack and you see like, it looks essentially like prison bars on it. It's kind of hard to see, but there's like prison bars on it. This is the dominant retail channel for most Filipinos. 90+% of mobile telecom loads go through that channel. Highly, highly, highly traditional. If you're somebody who's actually selling shampoo, you need to figure out how to organize and be able to sell to that disorganized retail type of channel. Indonesia, GDP per capita, it's a bit different, but it's kind of in the same ballpark. Very, very organized. So Alfamart and Indomart are actually kind of the premier retailers in Indonesia. Very modern. They essentially look like a 7-Eleven. They put Carrefour out of business. How does a convenience store put a hypermarket out of business? Well, it's because of a very simple thing. Indonesian consumers value convenience to a ridiculous extent. Whereas all of you wouldn't bat an eyelid at saying, well, I'll drive 30 minutes to Doncaster or to this mall to kind of go to some big box so I can get a few bucks off, or I can buy like my 500 Pampers together. Indonesian consumers, I want it. If I'm on this side of the street, I'll go there. I'll never go to the store on the other side of the street. So if you're a player in the consumer space, you need to understand that when you go into Philippines or Indonesia, the way that you're going to kind of think about your channel strategy will be fundamentally different. Even though on the face of things, they look like fairly similar countries.
We picked up a representative sample of about 300 odd consumers in emerging markets, where we asked them to rank what they thought of Australian products and services. And it's fairly close, right? When we're going into these markets, are we carrying these attributes of our services or our products or our offerings into these markets? And then we're positioning ourselves around these themes. While we ensure we tailor to the local market, we need to stick to our core key strengths. When you're sending your executives or your resources into these developing or emerging countries, most people don't want to go, right? Because I don't want to go work in Indonesia or live in Jakarta. It's not going to be fun, right? So then you find who's sort of put their hand up and said, yes, I want to go into Jakarta and stay there for 3 months. You'll pick that guy and say, okay, now off you go, and you're going to run a business there. The point we're making is don't make these decisions based on availability. You have to make these decisions based on fit. There's these telecom tower sites, the designs came from Europe. They were sort of built out in London and they were shipped through, and people were told, okay, the network guys were told in India, this is the design, just go get it installed, find companies that will do it for you, right? And they said, we're not sure this works, but they were told, no, just do it. So they said, fine. So they rolled out these telecom networks and these sites. And one big thing they forgot to account for, which obviously wasn't even an issue in Europe, was lack of electricity availability, right? There are enough and more power cuts that happen all the time in these emerging markets. Now, in Europe, when the designs were made, they said, we'll just have these batteries. So if there is a power cut for 15, 20 minutes, the battery suffices. And they didn't even plan for generators. And in India, half the sites today actually only run on diesel generators. And there was just such a complete disaster because they rolled out the network and then all the sites, they just kept failing and there was no network and they were slammed by the consumers. And let's just make sure we're empowering our local leadership. Those of you who've been to KFC in the US, it's a very, very takeaway centric concept, right? Where people sort of come in, pick up their food and walk out. When KFC entered China, they realized very, very quickly that the Chinese consumer, when they were actually coming to eat at KFC, it was a little bit of an event. They were coming in with their families, it was a nice evening out, you get your kids in there, you spend a nice hour and you eat some food and then you sort of go back. And they then customize for that, right? Their stores in China are almost double the size of what they are in the US. And then in terms of the menu, the US has a very, very limited menu, very, very sharp and just 28, 29 items. In China, they doubled that menu because they knew that consumers were coming in, they will want variety in China, and they also varied the tastes by different provinces. Walmart, big retailer, right? Biggest retailer in the world. They decided to enter India in 2005. Foreign direct investment in retail was not allowed in India. But they said, we'll still come in because the government had promised that they would relax that rule in the next 2 years. And they came in, they tied up with the local company, and they set up the entire back end, they set up the distribution, and they set up their wholesale business in the hope that, because the government had said they will change the ruling, they will change the regulation. There's a right-wing government that came in last year, and they said, we're not going to allow FDI in retail. And now, Walmart's had to pull back. The learning for us is when you're entering a country, whatever is the regulation or the regulatory environment, make sure you're planning your business on the basis of that. And you're not sort of assuming something will change in the future.
Wow, failure rate. Let's take one company that actually is really trying very hard to succeed in emerging markets, Electrolux. Electrolux now, in order for you to have access to the top 10 spots on their global executive board, you must do a rotation in Indonesia.
I would question whether JVs are always the right way to go. My own recommendation with JVs is if it's an industry that's highly regulated or there's a lot of uncertainty about the way it will shape up, then it makes sense to go in for a JV with a local partner. But if you've got a very, very powerful product and service that is compelling enough and that is in a market where there is white space, then you should go on your own. Now, having said that, if you do decide to go down the JV path, you've got to make sure your local partners, your joint venture partners, have the right political access.
The American business sense that the American business way is the right way. And if you go into that with that mindset into emerging markets, you will get screwed. Right? Because I'm sorry, but the American business way is not always the right way. Capitalism, in terms of, we always talk about democracy works. Singapore is a great example of how kind of democracy works, right? Singapore would not be where it is today without some kind of authoritarianism. So I think, to me, it's a bit of you need to have a bit of an open mindset and you have to be kind of willing to accept that there are different business practices and have an open mind. Otherwise, people will not respect you.
To encourage people to invest in emerging markets, we made $110 million worth of loans during the year, largely to emerging markets, not a single default.